Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This summer, President Obama has lobbied Congress to enact immigration reforms with the hope of reducing illegal immigration and streamlining the process through which people move to the United States. Much of the discussion is centered around children immigrating to the U.S. from Central and South America, who often come unaccompanied with the hope that their families will be able to join them at a later date. Today on Global Journalist, we look at the issue of immigration, the current discourse surrounding it, and what could happen next. I'm joined from El Paso, Texas by Victor Manjarrez, who's the head of the Unaccompanied Alien Children Project, part of the National Center for Border Security and Immigration at the University of Texas at El Paso. From Tucson by Cristina da Silva Iddings, an associate professor of language, literacy, and culture, focusing on early childhood at the University of Arizona. And from Houston by Christina Sisk, an associate professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Houston. Welcome to all of you. I just wanted to jump in right away and just sort of ask you, Victor, if you would, could you talk just a little bit about who these children are, remind our listeners why it is we've seen such a huge surge of unaccompanied minors at the U.S. border recently?
Absolutely. Most of these children that are coming up are really from three countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Typically, those have been the nationalities other than Mexico, the large portion that have entered the United States. And what the Department of Homeland Security has seen the last 2.5 to 3 years is a steady rise of the unaccompanied alien children heading north, traveling through Mexico, and making an illegal entry into the United States, principally through the tip of Texas, down in the Brownsville area. And that really kind of hit the high tide of the first of this year with numbers like they've never seen before. Actually, other than Mexican nationals, unaccompanied alien children surpassing the number of alien children from Mexico that were arrested. That's never really happened in the history of the Border Patrol. Typically, they're coming up to they come from the poorest places, the poor of the poor, from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Some are coming to reunify with family members that may be in the United States, others with the hope of bringing family members in the future.
And Ana Cristina da Silva, I was hoping, could you just walk our listeners through, if I was one of these children in Honduras, how would I go about how do I end up at the U.S. border? What does the journey look like?
Well, I think several of them come through Mexico, and they have to get into La Besta, which is the train that crosses the border.
La Bestia, that's the beast, right?
That's what that means. But I believe that has changed some now, but there are numerous attempts for these children to cross these borders. It's not an easy proposition at all. Sometimes they have to ride on top of those trains. They're victimized by coyotes. They're victimized by others who are, constantly attacking them. Is a very subhuman condition that they have to go through to be able to.
The coyotes being the child traffickers. Is that what you mean, or the human traffickers? Then?
Correct, and drug traffickers sometimes. Yes.
Good. And do you have a sense how much does this journey cost?
Ooh, I don't have a real sense of how much exactly it costs, but there is, I would imagine between $1,000 and $10,000, anywhere in the vicinity of that.
And Victor Manjarrez, if I could just bring you back in, once the children make it through Mexico on this sometimes train journey, when they make it to the U.S. border, how are they being apprehended, and sort of what happens to them immediately after they are taken into custody by U.S. Border Patrol agents?
In most cases, what the Border Patrol was saying was actually the children not seeking to evade arrest. They were actually surrendering, wading across the Rio Grande River, finding a Border Patrol agent and surrendering, saying that that they're a national from whatever the country they may be from. Then the agent really does two things. They determine alienage and deportability, and based on those two things, they find they make an arrest. They're transported to the station, and then typically they're immediately processed for an administrative hearing. And in essence, it's kind of like a police department. It's the booking information, an arrest report, biographical information, questions about health status. And as this processing is going on, Border Patrol agents are making contact with Health and Human Services, particularly the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, looking for a placement decision. Where's this child going to be placed? Are they going to be placed in a local area or, the nearest shelter? On that, they strive to place this child within 72 hours. But due to the sheer numbers, they were having a hard time meeting the 72-hour rule that was really placed by those by two pieces: the Homeland Security Act of 2002 and the Flores versus Reno Act, and so that they should strive within 72 hours to place this child.
So typically then, within 3 days, they're in the custody of the Border Patrol for typically the first 72 hours, then they're often moved to either with family or to a separate contracted agency that will house them then. Is that correct?
That's correct. In most cases, they're going to a shelter that's contracted by Health and Human Services.
And Christina Sisk, if I could ask you, can you talk about why we're seeing such a large surge of unaccompanied minors now? What are some of the factors that are pushing them to make this really extraordinary journey from Central America to Texas?
Well, it's, I would say some of it starts in the 80s with Central American migration to the U.S. Part of what happens at that moment is that when Central Americans get to the Los Angeles area, they feel themselves displaced and also at odds with the gang population there, mostly Mexican American and African American, and they start forming their own groups. And a lot of times gang activity is seen as something coming from outside the U.S., but in this case, it's actually it's something that formed in the U.S. In fact, Calle 18, one of the gang names, the other one's the Mara Salvatrucha, both of them actually formed in Los Angeles. So you get these transnational gangs. Many of them were undocumented at that moment. And so were deported in the process. And that's when this violence starts in places like El Salvador. And there's a lot of connections between U.S. and Central America. And I would say this starts in the 80s, and the violence has escalated to a point that people are feeling threatened. I think that's one of the major points of contention. People think that these aren't children that are coming in, that they're actually gangs, but what do we do with the people who are actually fleeing for their lives? And we often talk about children, but there are many women coming with their children, and there's also men. So it's a widespread problem, and I would say that that's a short synopsis of how I see the issue.
So you're saying that one of the reasons that places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras have seen so much violence domestically is that they have imported these gangs from their own immigrants that traveled to the United States in the 1980s then?
Well, I don't know if I would say imported. I would say the U.S. exported because it's not like they were sent back by choice, right? They were deported from this country. And so it's an ongoing problem. Many of these, it's strange what happens because many of the gangs that are there have no memory. Many of them would be much more culturally American in many ways because they haven't had that contact, and then suddenly they get deported to El Salvador, and Honduras and all these other countries, and they feel displaced. So it's this process of continual displacement that displaces other people. I mean, it's just it's like this wave, it pushes and it just keeps going, right?
If you just joined us, you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're looking at the issue of immigration to the United States, the current discourse surrounding it, and what could happen next. I'm joined from El Paso by Victor Menjarez, who's the head of the Unaccompanied Alien Children Project, part of the National Center for Border Security and Immigration at the University of Texas at El Paso. From Tucson by Ana Cristina da Silva Iddings, an associate professor of language, literacy, and culture, focusing in early childhood at the University of Arizona. And from Houston by Christina Sisk, an associate professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Houston. You can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That's globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. And Ana Cristina da Silva, I just wanted to ask you, you came to this country as a 20-year-old from Brazil, so you weren't much older than many of the children that we're talking about now. Could you speak to how the sort of process and system of immigrating to the U.S. as a young person has changed from when you did it some time ago?
Yeah, so I had a little bit of a different circumstance than the ones who are coming now, but I came at a time of intense political turmoil in Brazil, where there was a lot of violence that was just rampant, and also not only from gangs and the different gang activities in the favelas, as we call it, which are the slums, but also inflicted by the, at the time, military regime. So there were numerous persecutions, and you had no place to go, in a sense, because there were, gangs, and the government also, or officials also, were not to be trusted. And I was actually in journalism school at the time, and which was a target for these government. They would pick up.
So it sounds like yours was a case where you faced some political persecution then as a journalism student then.
That's correct. And so I was sent here and by my parents, and I had some removed relatives. So in that way, I think there is some empathy for the children coming in now, or for the young adults coming in now, looking for family members to seek safety. And so at that time, it was a little easier perhaps to be here as an immigrant, especially from Brazil, coming from a different history than a lot of the Central Americans and the Mexican Americans coming in, or the Mexicans coming in. So, but at the same time, it's very difficult to navigate a new culture, a new language, new systems, new institutions, and as a 20-year-old, completely bewildered by what just happened to you, even though I came from a different background than most of these children coming in, it's still a very, very overwhelming.
So many of the challenges are still the same, it sounds like. And
Yeah.
Victor Menjarez, I wanted to ask you as well, I understand that there have been a series of waves of immigration from Central America in 2004, in 1994. What seems to be fueling these cyclical surges of immigrants, and what's different about the current wave?
Well, actually, Christina mentioned something in the mid '80s that I actually kind of forgot, to be honest with you. But the Immigration Reform Control Act of '86 really focused the nation in terms of illegal immigration, and so you saw a peak in arrests, and then a really focus in terms of resources going to the southern border. And as people forgot about the border or border security, it became a non-focus. There was a rise in illegal immigration along the southern border. And we saw that particularly in San Diego in about 1994, where we were seeing the other than Mexican nationals, typically, again, Honduras, Guatemalans, and El Salvadorans, coming up, and there were, civil wars, natural disasters occurring. Difference back then, though, there were family units. They weren't the children coming by themselves, but they were family units. And they were really doing the same thing. They were landing at the Tijuana airport. There was no fence at the time. There was a 1-inch cable that was typically laying on the ground. They would walk over the cable with their suitcase, find the nearest Border Patrol agent, and say, "We're here illegally." And they would process, as a young agent, we'd process them. And quite honestly, we sent them on their way before my shift ended on that, because there were simply no detention or holding centers with the idea that they would show up at an immigration hearing at a later date. Of course, right after that, the state of California was, electing a new governor. Proposition 187 kind of got the emotion going for the residents of California, and had the administration focus on additional resources. Additional resources came in. That flow was stopped. There was a focus, and then over time, that focus was lost. But there was a shift in immigration, and that shift was felt in the Tucson, Arizona area, in southern Arizona. And the numbers started increasing, and in the year 2000, that was a significant peak for the southern border in terms of arrests. And what they were seeing again, it was other than Mexican nationals picking up. And at that time, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, declared that he was going to end what they were referring to as catch and release. And what he meant by that was arresting, processing, and then releasing, with the idea that the individual would show up at a court hearing at a later date. Well, the country focused on that. There was discussion about immigration reform, so resources were poured into this, southwest border. That flow pretty much stopped, and there had been a focus. But in the recent years, although there's been a high focus, it hasn't been the same focus as that 2004, 2005. And as that focus has been reduced, resources either maintained or slightly reduced, that increase occurred again in South Texas. This time, the interesting dynamic, though, it had really not family groups. It's unaccompanied alien children from the same 3 sending countries. Again, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. On that, there had been a really significant difference on that. And what it looks like is the smuggling organizations really began to understand the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000. And of course, it was reauthorized 3 or 4 times afterwards, that there was a kind of a loophole that had been exploited. And that loophole was an unaccompanied alien child would be placed in a removal proceeding on that. But of course, if there isn't a detention center to hold them until the removal proceeding, they're placed in a shelter. And of course, the idea of the shelter is not to keep a child there long term. You want to repatriate them with a family group as soon as you can. So they do that with the idea that with the promise that they'll show up at a court hearing in the futures. So again, that's been a big difference is their children. But it seems like this has been happening almost every 10 years.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We are looking at the issue of immigration to the United States, the current discourse surrounding it, and what could happen next. I'm joined from El Paso by Victor Manjarres, who's the head of the Unaccompanied Alien Children Project, part of the National Center for Border Security and Immigration at the University of Texas at El Paso. From Tucson by Ana Cristina da Silva Iddings, an associate professor of language, literacy, and culture, focusing on early childhood at the University of Arizona. And from Houston by Christina Sisk, an associate professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Houston. You can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That's globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. Christina Sisk, I wanted to ask you, there's been a lot of coverage of resistance to the housing of some of these children in various communities. Within the United States, there have been protests. The governors of a number of states, including Indiana and Maine, have written to the White House protesting the presence of these children within their states. Can you talk to us a little bit about what seems to be driving this opposition and why this seems to be such a lightning rod issue right now?
Well, I think there are protests and counter-protests. You see 2 types of protests going on, right? You see the anti-immigrant protests, people who don't want the children or immigrants to come in from Central America. And then you see the people who are supportive of a process that can incorporate them fairly, right? And for example, here in Houston, there was a group, Stop the Magnet, about a month ago, organized freeway blogging on I-10, and quickly activists in Houston on the other side of it organized and did a counter protest. Now, it was interesting because you could see it was very visible, and I think this is telling also as how this is portrayed. There were maybe about 5 people who were against the immigration of the children, and the counter protests actually had nearly 40 people show up. But the biggest difference and what affected the visibility of these two groups was that the anti-immigrant population had a huge sign that said deport, which was really much more visible from anywhere you drove around that area on the bridge.
So you're saying in a way then that the opponents
Then the
are more
physical
media
threats
savvy.
are very visible. Yeah, well, I don't know if people are actually maybe they have more access to media, right? You have all kinds of stuff, but then it's actually a very complex issue because even though you don't see the counter protests quite as strongly in the media, in the traditional media, I'm talking television, the cable news stations, they are really quite present online, right? There are various immigrant groups that are supportive of this. So it's hard to separate past immigration, from other groups to what's happening to this, because they're very connected. You see people feeling tied to this or have certain feelings from past waves of immigration to how they react to this wave, right? So I don't know. It's very complicated, and I think it gets really heated. There was another protest here in Houston, close to the Mexican consulate, and that one got rather heated. One group inhabited one side of the street, the other side of the street. And the things that people yelled across the street were quite telling, right? The focus on the counter groups, and I say those who support the immigration, have tried to focus, and this is something that you see nationally, is on the question of love and doing a welcoming. In fact, the group who organized the counter protests actually formally decided to become the Women and Children Welcoming Committee, and in a month, the page on Facebook has nearly 900 or about 900 likes. In days, it went hundreds of supporters all across the U.S. So it's hard to tell. I think. Really, our nation here is divided. The U.S. is divided culturally and politically, and I think we can see from past elections as well, we're divided in terms of how we see what the U.S. is, how we define, going back to Jose Antonio Vargas's organization called Define American, but truly at the core of these discussions are what is it to be an American, and there are very distinct definitions of that which affect how people see the immigration issue.
Just to pick up on that, Ana Cristina de Silva Iddings, I want to ask you as well, one of the phenomenons with the current wave of immigration, not only are many of the children quite young, under 12, but there's also a significant proportion of them, nearly half I've read, that are girls. What are some of the different issues that they face, and how does that sort of change the equation?
Well, a lot of the girls are very vulnerable. It's a very vulnerable situation for them. that they're not only victimized by gangs, but they're also sexually used. And so a lot of the ones who are arriving here are actually pregnant as young as 14, 15 years old. So in a sense, you're getting two children in because they are, I actually have been called to go to the hospitals here and help them with the different issues that they're facing having to do with child labor and also shelter after they have the babies. But on the way here, there are numerous accounts of being sexually violated on the journey, and they actually anticipate that before they even leave. And some of them are taking injections, hormone injections, as well. As we take vaccines, perhaps go to different places that require that. They're taking hormone injections as a birth control. So, in the anticipation of being sexually assaulted, as they won't be pregnant.
We're losing your audio just a little bit, but that certainly sounds like one of the more disturbing phenomenon. And Victor, with just about a minute to go, I wanted to ask you, there was this giant surge of children in June and July. It's estimated at 57,000 this year, I think. But in August, reportedly, those numbers have dipped. What seems to be driving that?
Well, actually, it's the media that has helped us with the idea that the message going back that you're not going to be processed and placed in shelter. You're actually held for removal proceeding. It's kind of a strong message. It really went back to the smuggling organizations that were actually guaranteeing the family members that they would get their child to whatever the destination within the United States. So it was the perception of beefed up enforcement, but more importantly, the perception that they would be placed in the detention center until their removal proceedings began.
That's going to have to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our thanks to our guests, Victor Manjarrez, Ana Cristina da Silva Iddings, and Christina Sist. Casey Morell is our executive producer, and our lead producer this week is Varvara Fomina. Travis McMillan from RJI is our technical director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.